There are lives that move between lucidity and pain. In one of them is Fyodor Dostoevsky, a man who wrote from the edge. His story is understood through what he lived, the losses, the confinements and the illness that marked each stage and were transformed into thought. What turns so much suffering into such a deep look at the human being? While many tried to explain the world from ideas, he observed it in the direct experience of the human being. He saw how fear takes root, how consciousness remains awake, and how the soul faces its own shadows. Here begins the story of a man who turned pain into vision. Poor corridors and forbidden circles, from the guarded home to Siberia. Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky was born in Moscow in 1821. His father, Mikhail Andreevich, worked as a doctor at the Mariinsky Hospital for the Poor, and due to his position, the family lived within the complex. Since he was a child, Fyodor grew up among corridors where disease and misery were part of the daily landscape. The outside world was marked by the pain of others, the home by discipline. That mixture of compassion and authority defined his first environment. Mikhail was a severe man, accustomed to commanding both at work and at home. He controlled his children with constant rigor. Obedience was the rule and self-will hardly found space. The mother, Maria Fyodorovna, of a calm character and religious spirit, partially balanced that climate. She read them passages from the Bible, spoke to them of kindness and faith, and created moments of tenderness in the midst of domestic harshness. The child was formed between those two forces, the authority of the father and the gentleness of the mother. In 1837, the mother died of tuberculosis. The loss shattered the family balance. The father, affected by loneliness and alcohol, became more irritable. Fyodor and his brother Mikhail were sent to the School of Military Engineers in St. Petersburg. The capital received them with its characteristic coldness, strict regulations, military routines, and an emotional distance that accentuated isolation. However, the city offered something new: libraries, gatherings, and an intellectual world unknown to him. During those formative years, Dostoevsky discovered the reading of Shakespeare, Schiller, Goethe, Pascal, and Balzac. The translation of Eugénie Grandet by Balzac was his first paid literary work. Contact with that novel led him to request a leave from the army to dedicate himself to writing. In 1846, he published Poor Folk, the epistolary story of two humble souls struggling against urban adversity. The book moved the critics, and his name circulated among young authors seeking to renew Russian literature. For the first time, Fyodor felt that his voice could have weight in public life. The success coincided with a turbulent moment. The Russian Empire was still governed by an autocracy that repressed any attempt at political debate. Intellectuals looked toward Europe, where the revolutions of 1848 shook the monarchies, and dreamed of a Russia capable of reforming itself without shedding blood. In St. Petersburg, some young people met in clandestine circles to read and comment on forbidden texts. One of them was the circle of Mikhail Petrushevsky, a progressive official who opened his house on Fridays to discuss socialist and humanitarian ideas inspired by Charles Fourier and other French authors. Dostoevsky began to frequent that group. He was not a practical revolutionary, but he felt attracted by the moral debate they raised. There they spoke of educating the people, abolishing serfdom, and overcoming social indifference. The meetings were more intellectual than conspiratorial, although the Tsarist regime would not distinguish nuances. The police had orders to monitor all those who showed sympathy for Western ideas. Meanwhile, Fyodor lived with few resources. His life oscillated between moments of literary enthusiasm and periods of economic anguish. Translations, articles, and small commissions allowed him to survive. Despite the instability, he continued to believe that literature could modify the moral reality of man. The injustice he had witnessed as a child and the authoritarianism of his father had left him with a lasting obsession with human dignity. In the mid-1840s, his name was already known in literary circles. He collaborated with magazines and participated in discussions about the writer's mission. For him, the novel had to show the lives of those who never appeared in aristocratic salons. That focus earned him the respect of critics like Belinsky, a central figure in Russian thought of the time. The critics saw in Dostoevsky a continuer of Gogol, capable of giving voice to the oppressed and turning compassion into a narrative engine. The relationship between the two was intense and brief. Belinsky defended art at the service of social progress, while Dostoevsky began to sense that the human condition could not be explained only from reason. Ideological differences accumulated, but the dialogue marked his intellectual formation. From those encounters would emerge his interest in internal conflicts and moral guilt that would later feed his novels. The Russia of Nicholas I lived under a web of increasing censorship. The Tsar maintained a special police to detect subversive tendencies among students and officials. The Petrashevsky Circle was considered a focus of political heresy. The government decided to eliminate it preventively. In April 1849, the members of the group were detained. Dostoevsky was arrested in his apartment and taken to the Peter and Paul fortress. There he spent months without trial, waiting for a sentence that no one explained to him. During the imprisonment, the prisoners were subjected to interrogations and a calculated uncertainty. The imperial authority wanted to give a public lesson. The Tsar ordered the preparation of a mock execution for those accused of conspiring against the state. One morning in December, the prisoners were taken out to the courtyard and lined up before the firing squad. The officer read the sentences. The cold was intense. When everything was ready for the shot, a messenger arrived with an imperial order commuting the death penalty for years of forced labor in Siberia. That theater of death was a demonstration of absolute power. Dostoevsky understood that his life had changed forever. The state had reduced him to a subject without voice or name. The idealist who had believed in the power of ideas entered a stage of silence and forced obedience. Life in freedom ended there, and the years of punishment began in the frozen lands of the north. Frozen journey and forced labor, learning to live among prisoners. The journey to Siberia began in the middle of winter. Snow covered the roads, and the sleds moved with difficulty through blizzards. When the group crossed the Ural Mountains, Dostoevsky understood that he was leaving Europe behind. On the other side, a secret world awaited him, a vast land where the cold and the distance would be part of the punishment. Upon arriving in Tobolsk, the prisoners were housed in a fortress. There, handcuffed and tired, the writer met the wives of the Decembrists von Vizina and Frantseva. They secretly gave him religious books and a letter addressed to an officer who could help him. It was the last gesture of compassion before total isolation. A few days later, they continued on their way to Omsk. In that stage, he heard for the first time the name of Commander Krivtsov, an officer famous for his cruelty. The warning was clear. He had to be careful of him. Upon arrival, the new chief received them with shouts and threats. He ordered their heads shaved, their belongings confiscated, and warned that the slightest mistake would be paid with floggings. The tone was brutal, almost theatrical. Dostoevsky understood that his life was passing into the hands of an unpredictable man. The Omsk prison was surrounded by low walls and watchtowers. Inside, the prisoners slept on damp boards, sharing space with common criminals. The chains weighed day and night. The nobles were objects of mockery and hatred. "Before you punished us, now we punish you," the convicts repeated. There was no privacy or respite. Meals were distributed in buckets. The air was thick, heavy with smoke and sweat. The day began before dawn, and the forced labor lasted until night. Discipline was maintained by soldiers who also feared the commander. In his letters, Dostoevsky described those men as rough and resentful, unable to understand why a nobleman shared their fate. Living together was a constant test. Insults and provocations were part of the day. However, in the midst of that hostility, he began to observe something that surprised him. Under the roughness, gestures of humanity appeared. A prisoner could share his bread with another or help lift a heavy load without receiving anything in return. Small actions that did not fit with the image of pure evil that dominated at the beginning. That contradiction intrigued him more than any theory. Time in prison remained marked by the violence of the environment. Krivtsov maintained his dominance with unforeseen inspections. He moved between the wards looking for reasons to punish. Some said he had 8 eyes because nothing escaped him. In one of those rounds, he discovered Dostoevsky lying down during working hours and ordered his immediate punishment. Other officers interceded, and the penalty was not executed. The writer would remember it as a miracle. "God delivered me from him," he would write later. When the commander was dismissed for corruption, the prison breathed. Life was still hard, but the daily tension decreased. Over the years, Dostoevsky managed to communicate for the first time with his brother. In a letter written shortly after regaining partial freedom, he told that he had spent 4 years without news from anyone. He described in detail the sound of the chains, the humiliations, the diseases, and the fights between prisoners. He confessed that absolute loneliness had led him to imagine conversations with non-existent people. However, from that confinement he drew a new knowledge about the people of the country. Even the most violent, he thought, retained a spark of goodness. What an admirable people, he wrote, how much strength and how much hidden compassion under so much misery. During his imprisonment he received some permitted books, a Russian version of Pickwick Papers and another of David Copperfield. Those stories reminded him of the humor and humanity of Dickens and offered him a respite. Years later he would say that Mr. Pickwick was a distant model for his own Prince Mishkin. In the last months of prison he began to deal with some officers and former fellow students who helped him get clothes and some money. Thanks to them he was able to endure the final days of his sentence. In February 1854 he was released from prison, but his punishment continued. He was assigned the lowest rank of the Russian army and was destined as a private soldier in a Siberian battalion. Even in uniform he was still a prisoner. In Omsk he spent a month of convalescence before presenting himself at his new destination. In letters from that time, a mixture of hope and fatigue is noted. He was grateful for the relative freedom, but could not work or decide his future. He depended on the charity of friends and strangers. During that stage he met the young prosecutor Alexander Wrangel, an official from a noble family who had read Poor Folk and wanted to meet the author. The meeting was emotional. Wrangel brought letters and money from the Dostoevsky family. Upon reading them, Fyodor burst into tears. Both, moved, ended up embracing without saying a word. Since then they visited each other frequently. Wrangel became his main support and helped him improve his living conditions. Through that friendship, Dostoevsky felt part of the outside world again. He also established a relationship with Evgeny Yakushkin, son of an exile Decembrist, who met him when he was still wearing shackles. They talked about literature and the situation in Russia. Yakushkin left him money and promised to deliver a letter to Mikhail. The gesture returned to the prisoner a forgotten sensation, that of not having been completely erased. Knowing that someone remembered him sustained him during the following years. The battalion routine was less brutal than that of the prison, but no less controlled. Marches, exercises, and continuous surveillance filled the days. The writer survived thanks to the help of civilians who gave him temporary accommodation and his ability to adapt to military rules. In the midst of that precariousness, he dreamed of writing again. He asked his brother for books and thought about literary projects. He felt that the experience of the prison had revealed something essential about the human soul, and that he had to tell it. When Governor General Gorchakov was replaced, restrictions decreased. Dostoevsky obtained permission to receive correspondence and readings. Some companions considered him a reserved man with an intense gaze, prone to talking to himself. Others saw him as a survivor who had learned to listen more than to speak. Among the soldiers they respected him for his education and his calm. The years passed slowly. In 1859, the punishment officially ended. With the help of loans and contacts, he was able to begin the journey back to the European part of the empire. Crossing the Urals again, this time without chains, he paused. In front of a column that marked the limit between Asia and Europe, he crossed himself and gave thanks for having survived. He shared a bottle of liquor with his guide and toasted the end of the exile. That scene closed a decade of hardships. Upon arriving in Tver, he had to wait several months before obtaining permission to settle in St. Petersburg. The Ministry of War denied him the right to live in the capital, and each request required direct intervention from the Tsar. In that time he lived modestly, planning his literary return. He depended on the financial support of his brother, but also on his own will to remake himself. The letters of that year show him restless, full of ideas and projects. His goal was simple: to regain his name and show that he was not finished. Return after Siberia and night writing. The inner observer is born. When his exile ended, Dostoevsky returned to the capital of a different country than the one he had left. Russia was trying to modernize under the mandate of Tsar Alexander II, and the reforms were presented as the beginning of a new era. Serfdom was being abolished, newspapers spoke of progress, and salons discussed European science. In the midst of that enthusiasm, he returned after 10 years of silence and forced observation. In Tver, where he had to stay for some months before receiving permission to settle in St. Petersburg, he resumed writing slowly. He had lost contacts and lived with limited resources, but his desire to work overcame the difficulties. He wrote in the early morning in an austere room, surrounded by old books and letters from his brother. Those days marked his reunion with literature. At the end of 1859, he settled again in the capital. He found a larger, noisier, and more unequal city. Intellectuals argued in cafes, magazines, published manifestos, and political debate had become part of public life. Together with his brother Mikhail, he founded a magazine called Vremya, Time, with the purpose of uniting moral reflection and social reality. The publication sought a balance between European liberalism and Russian tradition. The journalistic work forced him to stay informed and to live with the new critics. Among them were the followers of Western thought, defenders of rationalism and science as an engine of progress. At the opposite extreme were the Slavophiles, convinced that the Russian soul was incompatible with the ideas of the West. Dostoevsky tried to listen to both sides. He did not declare himself as belonging to either. His experience in Siberia had made him distrust both abstract theories and moral dogmas. In the pages of Vremya, he published current chronicles and brief essays where he analyzed the situation in Europe. In 1862, he made his first trip abroad. He visited Germany, France, England, and Switzerland. He wanted to see up close the life he had so often imagined in books. He walked the streets of Paris, attended masses in Gothic cathedrals, and observed the industrial bustle of London. He was struck by the mixture of abundance and helplessness. In the English capital, he saw children sleeping under bridges and exhausted workers entering factories before dawn. That contrast between wealth and misery accompanied him throughout the trip. Upon his return, he wrote winter notes on summer impressions. The text gathered his observations on Europe and his disenchantment with the blind faith in progress. He admired the technical energy of the West, but felt that the human spirit was lost in the search for material benefit. In the pages of that book, the first signs of a new form of thought appear. Behind the traveler who looks at the modern world, the analyst who will soon explore human consciousness from within emerges. The work at the magazine continued, but tensions increased. The Tsar's reforms advanced slowly, and radical sectors gained visibility. Discussions among intellectuals became aggressive. In that environment, Dostoevsky concentrated on literary writing. He published The Insulted and Humiliated, a story about the fragility of family ties in a society that changes too quickly. Although the public received the novel well, the author felt he had been caught in old forms. He needed to go beyond social melodrama and enter the mind of the individual. The death of his brother Mikhail in 1864 aggravated his situation. He lost the partner, the friend, and the financial support. Debts haunted him. The magazine was closed and his health weakened. In the midst of that precariousness, he wrote his shortest and most intense work until then, Notes from Underground. The protagonist of that book is not a hero or a rebel. He is a man alone, sick, enclosed in his thought. He lives in a basement and speaks directly to the reader, trying to explain his behavior. The narrative moves forward like a monologue that alternates irony, anger, and despair. Through that voice, Dostoevsky shows the birth of a new figure, the modern individual, self-aware to the point of exhaustion, unable to act without doubting. The underground is not a physical place. It represents a mental state, the voluntary confinement of one who understands too much and no longer trusts anything. The character analyzes his own gestures, contradicts himself, mocks himself. In those pages, the tension that the author had felt since his return is concentrated. After having seen the power of the state in Siberia and the faith in science in Europe, he found himself trapped between two worlds that were incomplete to him. During the writing of Notes from Underground, epilepsy returned with force. The crises left him exhausted, but he continued writing. He dictated fragments to friends or assistants and corrected by hand with a trembling hand. In a letter of 1864, he mentioned that the novel was his attempt to tell the truth about man. He did not explain more. The truth he referred to was not a doctrine. It was the mixture of selfishness, compassion, and contradiction that he had observed in the prisoners and in ordinary people. The critics were divided. Some considered the text a personal confession. Others saw it as a satire of the dominant rationalism. Dostoevsky remained outside those discussions. He concentrated on surviving and paying his brother's debts. During those months, he moved from pension to pension, sold books to eat, and slept poorly. However, he felt that something had changed in his way of writing. He no longer sought to teach or moralize. He only wanted to show how man thinks when no one is watching. The period between 1860 and 1865 was a laboratory of ideas. In Vremya and in Epocha, the second magazine he directed for a short time, he addressed current topics with an increasingly personal tone. He analyzed revolutionary movements, the new theories on education, and the dilemmas of freedom. His texts were read by young students and by old officials trying to understand the direction of the country. The Russia surrounding him remained divided between those who wished to copy Europe and those who wanted to preserve the national essence. Dostoevsky saw the conflict as a dispute without an immediate solution. Meanwhile, he took refuge in writing. In the letters of those years, one perceives a tired man who works without rest and who hardly finds joy in the memory of his childhood or in the reading of the gospel that he always carried with him. Sleepless nights and impossible contracts, writing under economic threat. During 1865, Dostoevsky lived in a state of exhaustion and anxiety. Debts cornered him, and the lack of commissions threatened his livelihood. In the midst of that climate, he began to write again, looking for an idea capable of sustaining a great novel. He spent nights awake with papers piled next to a weak lamp, revising and discarding drafts. In his letters of that year, he spoke of fever, insomnia, and a sense of racing against time. He had agreed with the editor Katkov to send him a short story for the Russian Messenger, but soon the initial idea grew and transformed into a more ambitious project. At the end of November, he confessed to his friend Wrangel that he had destroyed the manuscript and started from scratch. He said he could not stand a satisfactory text when he could try something better. Thus, the plan for Crime and Punishment was born. While he was writing, his social life almost disappeared. He hardly left the house and received few visitors. He only maintained contact with Apollinaria Suslova, whose presence awakened in him a mixture of desire and despair. They argued frequently, hurt each other with words, and met again. She rejected his marriage proposals, and that tension left him emotionally exhausted. That relationship would later serve as material for The Gambler, where he transformed frustration into fiction. The first chapters of Crime and Punishment were published in January and February 1866. The public reacted with a mixture of enthusiasm and disturbance. Readers spoke of the book as a disturbing experience. Some read it without being able to sleep. Others said they felt oppressed by its intensity. Radical critics accused him of portraying students as possible murderers, but the general public turned it into a constant topic of conversation. That same year, a Russian student, Alexander Danilov, murdered a pawnbroker and her servant to rob them. The act seemed an exact replica of Raskolnikov's crime. The coincidences reinforced the impact of the novel, and its fame multiplied. Subscriptions to the Russian Messenger increased by hundreds of copies. Dostoevsky, however, still had no economic stability. Despite the success, he owed money to everyone. He feared being imprisoned by his creditors and losing the work in progress. The pressure led him to sign a risky contract with the editor Stelovsky. He committed to delivering a new novel before a year or losing the rights to all his future works. To fulfill it, he hired a young stenographer, Anna Grigorievna Snitkina, to whom he dictated The Gambler in just 26 days. They worked day and night, with brief breaks to eat or rest their eyes. From that exhausting pace, an effective relationship was born that soon became marriage. Anna would accompany him until the end of his life. After that delivery, the most fertile years of his career began. Between 1866 and 1869, he wrote almost without interruption. The experience of guilt, punishment, and the search for redemption became the core of his work. In Crime and Punishment, every detail reflects the tension between the reason that calculates and the conscience that punishes. Raskolnikov's crime, planned with cold logic, is transformed into an act that haunts him from within. Dostoevsky organized the narrative so that everything revolves around that inner struggle, and achieved a structure so precise that every word seems to have an echo many pages later. During 1867, he traveled with Anna through Europe to alleviate his health and escape creditors. They spent seasons in Germany, Switzerland, and Italy, always with financial difficulties. In Wiesbaden, the writer fell into gambling again. He entered casinos with the hope of winning enough to cancel debts, and left defeated. His losses were added to the epileptic attacks, which increased with stress. Even so, in the midst of that instability, he began to conceive his next great project, The Idiot. He wanted to create a completely kind character, someone truly beautiful, capable of showing the Christian ideal of love in a world that despises it. That idea obsessed him. He worked in hotels, rented houses and train cars, dictating paragraphs while they moved from city to city. In his letters he said he hardly slept and that his mind did not rest. The moves were constant: Geneva, Vevey, Milan, Florence. Between trips his first daughter was born, who died a few months later, a blow from which both took time to recover. The Idiot appeared in installments in The Russian Messenger in 1868. The story of Prince Mishkin, innocent and compassionate, confronted a society that confuses kindness with weakness. The public did not fully understand the proposal, but some readers perceived the depth of the experiment. Dostoevsky incorporated into the character his own experience before the firing squad, that awareness of life on the edge of death. Mishkin embodies the attempt to live according to absolute love, even when that ideal clashes with reality. The publication process was difficult. Epileptic seizures delayed him and forced him to send chapters incomplete. Part of the final text reached the press amidst composition errors and unfulfilled deadlines. Even so, the writer considered The Idiot his most intimate work. He said that those who appreciated it shared something essential with him. The novel ended in tragedy, but not as defeat. For the author, Mishkin's failure did not nullify the value of his faith, but showed it in its human limit. After finishing The Idiot, his financial situation became complicated again. Aid from editors was irregular and income arrived late. While recovering from a new attack, he began to think about a larger work. In a letter to his friend Maikov, he wrote that he was preparing a book titled Atheism. There, a man would appear who loses faith and plunges into moral chaos. That idea would later transform into The Demons, his great political novel. In 1869, when he was working on the last chapters of The Idiot, his attacks increased. He told his niece that he had had 2 in 10 days and that he could hardly write. Even so, he continued working until he fulfilled Katkov, his editor. In a later letter, he confessed that the novel had left him exhausted, but had also brought him closer to what he considered his truth: faith as an interior experience, without practical utility or visible reward. That conception of faith, free of proofs and justifications, defined the following years. Dostoevsky saw belief not as an argument, but as an act of existence. Trust in God, he thought, should not depend on results. In The Idiot, that conviction is expressed in every gesture of the prince, who maintains his compassion even in the face of contempt or violence. Between 1865 and 1871, Dostoevsky went from material despair to extraordinary creative maturity. Hardships, losses and illnesses mixed with constant production. In those years, the image of the modern man who observes, judges and destroys himself emerged. Conscience, guilt and freedom became central themes. He no longer wrote about social heroes or political causes. He wrote about individuals facing their own abyss. Upon concluding The Idiot, the writer understood that this tension could not be resolved. What had begun as a search for redemption ended as a portrait of the human limit. From that point, his work would advance toward a broader exploration of evil, faith, and the possibility of a collective salvation, but that would be the story of the next chapter of his life. Political murder and final novel, consecrated pen before Russian crowds. Between 1871 and 1881, Dostoevsky lived a decade of intense activity and growing recognition. He returned from abroad with a firm vision of the destiny of his country. He saw Russia divided between the imitation of Europe and the search for its own identity. From that moment on, he wrote convinced that his work should speak directly to his people. In those years he finished The Demons, a novel that portrays a generation fascinated by destruction. He based the story on recent events, the murder of the student Ivanov by a nihilist group led by Sergei Nechayev. The crime impressed him deeply. In fiction, he transformed that event into a story where a small circle of revolutionaries tries to cause chaos to refound society. He worked tirelessly between 1870 and 1872, reviewing each installment for the Russian Messenger. The pressures of the editor, censorship, and attacks from the press wore him down. The Demons generated controversy. Some critics accused him of deforming political reality and attacking radical youth. Others recognized that the novel captured the moral climate of an era. For him, the objective was not to make propaganda, but to show how ideas could turn against those who proclaimed them. The characters emerged from real life: the fanatic Shatov, the cynical Stavrogin, the manipulator Verkovensky. In them is reflected the attempt to replace faith with ideology. Dostoevsky observed how the desire to redeem the world could end in the denial of all responsibility. In his letters he explained that he wanted to write about the demons that inhabit the Russian soul, referring both to political passions and to the most intimate impulses. When the novel appeared complete in 1872, the author faced fierce criticism. Radicals labeled him reactionary, and conservatives looked at him with suspicion. However, the work circulated widely and consolidated his reputation. The Demons marked the transition from social vision to spiritual reflection. There, evil is not only a political structure, but a force that can spring up in any individual. During the following years, he continued publishing in magazines and participating in public debates. In 1873, he began to edit a writer's diary, a personal space where he commented on current events, judicial reforms, the situation of the peasants and conflicts between Russia and the West. He wrote in the first person, alternating analysis and anecdotes as if conversing with his readers. His direct and morally committed style attracted a huge audience. In the midst of that activity, he began to conceive his most ambitious work. For a long time, he had been thinking about a novel that would bring together all his concerns: freedom, faith, guilt, and redemption. In 1878, after the death of his young son Alyosha, that idea took final shape. The pain led him to return to the gospel that he had kept since Siberia. There he found the impulse to write The Brothers Karamazov. The work began in 1879 and lasted 3 years. He was then living in Staraya Russa, a quiet town where he could concentrate far from the capital. He dictated entire pages to his wife Anna and corrected each proof with obsessive attention. He said that that novel should be his spiritual testament. In letters to his friends, he spoke of a story of parricide and faith. The Brothers Karamazov was published in installments in the Russian Messenger between 1879 and 1880. From the first issue, readers perceived that it was something different. The Karamazov family brought together 3 generations of conflict. The father, Fyodor Pavlovich, symbol of corruption. The sons, Dmitry, Ivan, and Alyosha, representatives of 3 forms of response to the world. Dmitry, impulsive and passionate. Ivan, rational and skeptical. Alyosha, believer and compassionate. Each one embodies a possibility of the human soul. The murder of the father unites their destinies. The judicial investigation, the interrogations, and the crossed confessions serve the author to pose the questions that had haunted him since youth. Can justice exist without faith? Where does guilt begin, and where does freedom end? While writing, Dostoevsky studied in depth the religious and philosophical texts that inspired his characters. He incorporated readings from Schiller, the Gospel, and contemporary Russian thinkers. The solemn tone and extensive dialogues gave the work an unprecedented density. In the monastery scenes, he introduced the figure of the elder Zosima, a spiritual guide who represents the Eastern mystical tradition. His speech on forgiveness influenced all subsequent literature. The author worked with feverish intensity. He revised the proofs until dawn and barely slept. In November 1880, exhausted but satisfied, he sent the last part to the editor. In a letter he wrote, "I have worked 3 years and spent 2 publishing. It is a decisive moment for me." Shortly after, he stated that he wanted to live 20 more years, although he knew that his health was fragile. In those months he received unexpected recognition. Leo Tolstoy, who rarely praised his colleagues, read House of the Dead and sent a letter to his friend Strakov. "I know no better book in our modern literature. It is human, sincere, and Christian." When Dostoevsky read those words, he was deeply moved. He kept the letter and spoke of it for days. Between both writers there were differences, but they shared the desire to explore the moral condition of man. Dostoevsky's fame reached its peak in 1880, when he was invited to deliver a speech in Moscow during the inauguration of the Pushkin Monument. That day, in front of thousands of people, he spoke of the spiritual unity of the Russian people and the universal mission of their culture. Many attendees burst into tears. The press described the scene as an act of national reconciliation. Since then, he was seen as a moral figure above political disputes. At the end of that year, he finished the final chapters of The Brothers Karamazov. The work was received as the culmination of his career. Critics highlighted its breadth and its prophetic tone. Some compared it to the Divine Comedy or King Lear. In it, Dostoevsky managed to unite family drama with religious reflection and psychological analysis. At the beginning of 1881, his health worsened. He suffered hemorrhages caused by an untreated aneurysm. On January 27, he had a severe relapse. That night, he asked his wife to light a candle and read him a passage from the Gospel that he had kept since Siberia. The text spoke of Jesus asking John for baptism and of the response, "Let it be so now. It is proper for us to do this to fulfill all righteousness." Hearing it, he said in a low voice, "It means that today I will die." He spent the last hours in calm, thanking Anna for the life shared. He asked her to take care of his children and to keep his faith alive. He died shortly after noon, with the sacred book in his hands. The funeral became an unprecedented public demonstration. Thousands of people accompanied the procession through the streets of St. Petersburg. Students, workers, and officials marched together, some carrying copies of his novels. For many, Dostoevsky represented the moral conscience of Russia. His tomb in the Alexander Nevsky Monastery was covered with flowers and letters for weeks. In the following days, the press across Europe published obituaries. In Russia, newspapers spoke of his legacy as if he were a prophet. His works remained alive in the memory of readers of different ideologies. Liberals admired him for his defense of human dignity, believers for his unwavering faith, the young for his sincerity. At his death, Dostoevsky left a country in crisis, but also a transformed literature. He had shown that the question of good and evil does not belong only to religion or philosophy, but to daily life. The Demons and the Brothers Karamazov closed a cycle begun in the Omsk prison, the passage from personal pain to the understanding of human destiny. His last decade condensed the entire trajectory of a man who knew prison, poverty, and glory. Writing was his way of resisting and his form of believing. In each character he left a part of himself, and in each reader he sowed doubt and hope.